Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. Got a returning guest tonight, and it's a guest that those of you that watch EWTN regularly over especially the last 14, 15 years is a guest that you'll recognize, Dale Ahlquist. A good friend. The only negative is the only time I get to see him is when we're doing a program once in a while.
Great to see you.
It is Dale. It is good to see you. You're way up in that frozen tundra up north, that part of America. It's probably getting snow already, right?
Well, it's probably a little cold up there. It's only cold about 9 months out of the year, so I don't know why people complain. So.
But it is good to have you on the program. And of course, when people think of your name, at least this part of your life, it's always synonymous with G.K. Chesterton. It's probably not something you thought about when you were growing up, but we'll get to that in a moment. What I thought, as we begin though, for the audience, is remind them of the number of things that you've been able to do on EWTN.
Yes, well, in addition to being a guest on your show over the past several years, I've had that series, The Apostle of Common Sense, that's been running for, I think, 14 years now.
Yeah.
And that grew out of one of our times together. I think that the first time I was on The Journey Home, as I stepped off the set, the producer came up to me and said, "We have to do a whole series on Chesterton." And I said, "That's a great idea. Let me see if I can find someone who would be interested in doing this." He said, "Oh, we want you." And I was really pleased to do this. And it has been a unique show. I think it's not only unique to EWTN, it's unique to television. There's just nothing quite like it because Chesterton has this amazingly broad reach, and people come to discover him for all different reasons. But I've been great privilege to work with Chuck Chalberg, who portrays Chesterton, and then I think about the third season we brought in Kevin O'Brien and his actors to add some dramatic vignettes to the show, and created some new characters ourselves, like the infamous Stanford Nutting that Kevin portrays. But the show is right now. There's a bunch of new episodes on right now, and so.
That's great.
Good stuff, yeah.
Well, I had that privilege, remember, way back when.
Yes.
Remember that?
Yes, you interviewed G.K. Chesterton, yes. Yeah, you sat at your desk, and Chesterton was in 1930 in his park in London there, answering your questions.
Yeah, that was fun, and I enjoyed it. And because that was the beginning, then I did with Kevin O'Brien, a number of interviews as a result of that.
With historic converts.
Yeah. So that's good. So I've appreciated your work, and I know that I've mentioned this to you, but I remember once, I think I was in England, sitting with a cup of tea, and on a table was a big, thick book on the greatest British authors. And I thought, great, so I'm leafing through this, and to my chagrin, I noticed neither Belloc nor Chesterton were even mentioned in the book.
Case of false advertising on the cover, right?
Right,
yes.
But my thinking is that's part of what you're all about, is helping us remember this great, not just author, but lover of Jesus Christ and his church.
That has been truly my motivating force. When Chesterton was alive, he was considered one of the greatest authors of English history, and that reputation continued for a while, and then all of a sudden he just went into a total eclipse. And I discovered Chesterton sort of by accident, Marcus, and when I did, I realized, okay, this is one of the most important writers I've ever read, and why wasn't I exposed to him? How could I get through a 4-year college of liberal arts without ever having been exposed to such an outstanding writer? And that led one thing to another. I first discovered Chesterton, and then through Chesterton, discovered the Catholic Church.
It's been 10 years since you've been on the journey home. So for those, I will say that the original episode that you were on is available online or through EWTN. But why don't you give a little snippet of where you came from spiritually, just a little.
Raised an evangelical Baptist, Marcus. Had a famous brother-in-law who was a Jesus rock singer in the 1970s named Larry Norman. And it was Larry Norman who saw me reading Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis and just simply said, "You like C.S. Lewis?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Have you ever read G.K. Chesterton?" And I said, "I've never heard of G.K. Chesterton." He said, "Well, if you read Chesterton, you don't even need to read C.S. Lewis."
in my mind, remembering Larry Norman, I can't picture him reading G.K. Chesterton.
I can't picture him reading G.K. Chesterton either. I can't picture him reading any books. I can only picture him playing his guitar and singing very loudly into a microphone.
Right.
But he was just a really brilliant guy, and he would sneak books into his day somehow, because he just was an amazingly, he had a wide reach. He was a very close personal friend of Malcolm Muggeridge. And so his own spiritual journey was kind of interesting too. He, rest in peace. He died about 3-4 years ago, and but I had a nice reconciliation with him before he died, and he saw what I had done with the work with Chesterton, and he thanked me for that, and I was able to thank him for introducing me to Chesterton. But I started reading Chesterton on my honeymoon. Yeah, right in the shadow of that building right over there. Our hotel room was just 3 blocks from St. Peter's, and I was reading G.K. Chesterton's The Everlasting Man, because that was the book that was so influential on C.S. Lewis. That was the book that really brought him to the Christian faith. C.S. Lewis said afterwards, after his own conversion to Christianity, a young man who's serious about his atheism cannot be too careful about what he reads. Chesterton really did a number on him, and of course we were in Rome on our honeymoon on a kind of a historic time. It was when John Paul II was shot, yeah. And so as I tell people, since I was a Baptist, I was one of the suspects. But Chesterton really, he put me on the road to Rome. Ironically, it began in Rome. Kind of reflects one of his own novels where he says, the first line of The Everlasting Man is, there's 2 ways to get home. One of them is to stay there. The other way, you have to go all the way around the world to get home.
You brought up Baptist, friend of a well-known Christian singer at the time. Then you become Catholic. When you look back over the years, when did Jesus Christ become life-changing to you? What was it?
Well, I was really raised in a very devout Christian household. And I really always had a relationship with Jesus Christ from my very early days. And, loved the Bible, loved my relationship with Jesus. And, Chesterton, it was about a 16-year process from the time I started reading Chesterton to the time I actually was received into the church. And it was a long, slow, deliberate process. And it's interesting, Chesterton's own conversion was much the same way. It was really about a 22-year journey for him before he was received into the Catholic Church. And so it really was a slow process of seeing these things in a Catholic light before you realize that you're seeing that in a Catholic light. It was a very subtle transition that was happening within my mind and within my heart. As I started slowly realizing that I wasn't thinking like a Protestant anymore. I was starting to think like a Catholic. I think the hardest thing, I think, for a Protestant coming into the church is to even grasp what a sacrament is, to even understand what a sacrament is. And
especially from a Baptist
background. Just no sacraments whatsoever, even though the name of our denomination is named after a sacrament that we insist be done a certain way, even though it's not a sacrament.
I apologize, it's going to sound like a little bit of an infomercial, but in our work in the Coming Home Network, our main mission is how do we help non-Catholic Christians discover the beauty of the Catholic Church. And in our work, we've come to recognize that at least the first 3 steps of the strategy is the very first step is helping them see that the Catholic Church is a Christian church, because many of them don't even recognize that the Catholic Church is Christian. And then second, that good Catholics are Christians. And thirdly, that all authentic Catholic doctrines and teachings and practices, devotions, are authentically Christ-centered. We have to begin there before we can get into the doctrines. Does that ring true with your own journey? I mean, if you look way back and you looked at the Catholic Church, was it a Christian church to you?
Yeah, way back, I would have probably argued that. I would have said there's certain things that are not right, but Jesus is in there somewhere. But the Baptist doctrine is basically established by taking what the Catholic Church teaches and somehow rejecting that. You know, it's you have to figure out what the Catholics think. Okay, now there must be some other correct interpretation than the Catholic one, and so there is this both subtle and overt anti-Catholicism, which certainly is what I grew up with. So, but I started realizing when I met authentic Christian Catholics, I realized, okay, they're Catholic, and that was the first time that started happening, long before I even thought about becoming Catholic.
Did Larry Noman realize that Chesterton was Catholic?
I don't know that he did. I think he must have, because of the Father Brown stories were certainly one of the things that he read.
Yeah.
But I really tried to get around that as much as possible when I started reading Chesterton, because I considered him so completely true in the things he was saying and the insights that he offered. And I said, okay, I know that at some point he became Catholic, but I'm going to just set that aside right now and just not deal with that and just keep discovering Chesterton. And maybe there's going to be some way to finally snake around that little flaw in Chesterton's thinking. And obviously, the more you read Chesterton, the more you realize, well, not only is it just one of the things that happened to him, it's the center of everything, and all of his great insights come back to that central truth.
I'm wondering if those 3 steps, initial steps, at least recognizing that the Catholic Church is Christian, and that good Catholics are Christians, and that good Catholic doctrines and devotions are Christ-centered. Was that a similar barriers for Chesterton himself to get over?
I don't think so. I mean, when he was very young, he used to spit out some of the typical anti-Catholic propaganda, but that was when he was a teenager. I think as soon as he really embraced the Christian faith, I think he was an Anglo-Catholic at that point.
Okay.
I think he thought that the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church were really the same thing, and that's what really he was on a road at that point where he knew it was going to end in Rome. And he even said at one point to his great mentor, Father O'Connor, who's the inspiration for the Father Brown character, he said, I'm no longer a Protestant, but I can't yet call myself a Catholic.
But he does talk about this, because he does mention in his book, The Catholic Church, A Conversion, that's kind of what he sees as the first step.
Oh, yes. Because there is this built-up plaque of anti-Catholicism that a non-Catholic Christian has to deal with. And in his book, The Catholic Church, A Conversion, he says, the first step to becoming Catholic is you decide you're going to be fair to the Catholic Church, which means it doesn't mean you're going to believe everything the Catholic Church is. You're just not going to believe all the objections you've heard necessarily. We're going to give the Church a fair chance to make its case. And then he immediately follows upon it. The problem is, he says, there is no being fair to the Catholic Church, because either you are for it or you're against it. And as soon as you stop being against it, you are suddenly drawn towards it. You suddenly realize you're rooting for it. Yeah. And then comes the second stage, which he says is discovering the Catholic Church, just learning all the things that you didn't know. And he says it's like being in a foreign country with all these exotic flowers and butterflies and things that you've never seen or heard of. And that's the fun time. And I certainly remember that in my own conversion too, when you just are soaking up all these things that had not been part of your Christian experience. The church fathers and this 1,500 years of history and the saints and all these great stories that truly are bringing you closer to Christ. And he says the fun part about that is that you still have no commitment. You don't have to do anything. You just soak it all in. You can just leave anytime you want. You turn around and walk out of this beautiful conservatory. But then he says comes the third stage, which is running away from the Catholic Church. Because once your head is convinced, once the intellectual objections have been cleared, it really has to be an act of the will. Because it's not going to be just a purely intellectual conversion. At some point, you have to make the decision, this is what I'm going to do. And your heart is telling you at that point, do not do what you're thinking about doing. You must find the door and you must get out. And that running away period, just avoiding the thing that everything is pushing you towards. And Chesterton says the convert enters with his head bowed. It's an act of humility. And he says the outside people are watching and they imagine the convert entering a sort of prison or dungeon. And but for the convert, once he enters the church, he realizes that it's larger on the inside than it was on the outside. The outside world is narrow and cramped, and really the prison.
In our work, we call that the no man's land.
Yeah.
When usually a non-Catholic Christian clergyman goes through those stages, at least is a little bit open to the Catholic Church. He's just going to it's at least one of many churches. Let's put it, at least they're there. And then they start to discover the discovery stage. But then once they recognize the fullness of so much of Catholic truth, of course, then they start to realize the implications on their vocation, on friends, family, and how difficult that can be.
And there's really nowhere to turn to it. It is the no man's land, because you can't talk to any of your Protestant friends. They don't understand what you're going through. And unfortunately, the sad thing is that most Catholics don't understand it either, because they haven't been through that same road that the convert has to travel.
As a Baptist Christian, in love with Jesus Christ, standing outside and looking at the church, and really even wondering whether it's Christian or not, or they're going to give it, whether those sacraments, those doctrines, are they just a burden, like in Pilgrim's Progress, that need to be cast off? How has becoming a Catholic brought you closer to Jesus?
Well, the discovery of the sacraments and the saints were the two things that really brought me closer to Jesus. And I think it started probably with the saints. It's one of the main reasons I believe that Chesterton is a saint, because he helped me understand what the community of the saints meant. It was something that was not part of our theology at all. You do not pray to anyone else except Jesus. Don't let anyone get in the way there. Those Catholics, they pray to saints. But then I heard, I heard that someone wanted to promote Chesterton's cause for canonization. And there was not much of a Chesterton movement in those days. This is 20 years ago, and I had just an epiphany, Marcus. I just realized in one split second what the communion of saints meant. I meant, saints don't get between you and Jesus; they bring you closer to Jesus. And saints are your friends. You become a friend with a saint. You have they're a companion, a fellow companion on the road to heaven, and you have a sense of that this is a model. This is someone who has lived the Christian life in a very full and complete way, and sometimes it's easier to follow the model than to follow something abstract of what the Christian life means. In fact, Chesterton makes that same point in his book on St. Francis of Assisi. He says, you can't look directly at the sun, but you can look at the moon, which is reflecting the sun, and you can look right at it. And he says that's what St. Francis is. He's the moon to Christ's sun, and you can look directly at that, and he's reflecting the light of Christ on you. And I said, okay, I see this intercessory role. And of course, we understand that Christians don't have any trouble asking other Christians to pray for them. Well, why not ask someone who's in the presence of Christ to pray for them? In fact, it was very clear that Chesterton, to me, very clear that he was in the presence of Christ. And then I also, for the first time, understood what it meant that there's a cultus around every saint, a cult. And I realized I belonged to the cult of Chesterton. And I was okay with that. It was a new thing, and so didn't.
All of our Baptist listeners wondering, we need a cult? What
Yeah,
are you
cult.
talking
Yeah,
about?
what a cult. Yeah, that's why I said cultus. Yes,
Right.
but it is true. Every saint has a cult of those who are devoted to that saint, for some reason that saint is particularly meaningful in helping them walk with Christ.
Right.
And then so I discovered the other saints too, and what a variety, and realizing that. When we studied the Bible, we had these heroes of the faith that we always study. We always study what Abraham and Isaiah did and what Paul did and everything. But the story didn't stop there. At the end of the New Testament, you have these other giants, this cloud of witnesses that continued for the next 1,500 years. And discovering those who had this close and really intimate relationship with Jesus, they helped bring me closer to Jesus too.
All right. And then our guest tonight is Ahlquist.
Yeah.
And you'd also mentioned the sacraments
Yes.
as a key aspect of bringing you closer to Christ.
Well, I'll tell you, I have to echo what Chesterton said about confession. He says, when you walk out of confession, you are 5 minutes old. Your whole life has started over again. And there's just nothing that matches hearing those words, I absolve you of your sins. And just feeling the burden come off you, that your sin is not an obstacle between you and God anymore. It's you are now back in full communion with God. There's just nothing that compares with that sacrament. And to realize that, even though we have that great hesitation of going into the confessional, it's an act of worship to enter that confessional. You are worshiping God when you're there, confessing your sins to the priest, and then the ultimate sacrament of the Eucharist. Chesterton really helped me understand that too, because he says thanks is the highest form of thought, and that's what Eucharist means. It means thanksgiving, and the only possible response that we can have to so great a gift is thanksgiving. We've done nothing to earn this. We've done nothing to somehow grasp it better because of our theological understanding. We can only be thankful, and that's why it is our duty, as the priest says, and our salvation to always and everywhere give God thanks.
When did Chesterton die?
He died in 1936.
36, okay. The reason I mention that is he lived a long time ago.
Yeah.
In a different world. His earlier life would have been a life without electricity, even without automobiles, without planes. Maybe a life without indoor plumbing. I mean, who knows?
In fact, all those things developed during his lifetime. He watched all those things come into the world.
Just amazing. Yeah. And but some might say, well, our world has changed drastically. Internet, space travel, all the stuff that happened after him. What does he have to say about a Christian trying to live today? Did he have a clue of what our world would be like?
Well, I think he had a clue of what our world would be like, because so much of what he said is so prophetic. If you read Chesterton now, it seems like he's writing for now. It's absolutely one of the most astonishing things about Chesterton as a writer, really as a prophet, is that he sees all the same dilemmas we're facing, sees that technology is something that can become something that we become enslaved to rather than serves us. He always warned about becoming too dependent on technology, because then it's not serving us anymore. We are dependent on it, and that's not freedom. And of course, he has the great line that we've come up with the best ways of communication in all of history precisely at the moment when we have nothing to say. and Chesterton, I think he clearly has a clue, and he sees that the information technology can start to be overwhelming because we can lose the truth in all these fragments of facts, and sometimes they're not facts.
Right.
And I think that he's as edifying to read now, and possibly even more to read now than in his own lifetime.
What about his buddy Belloc?
Yeah, what about him?
Let me mention at least him. I'm a big fan of his buddy Belloc, and I know your main life is about Chesterton, but Belloc tags along.
He does. Marcus, when you're done with the journey home, you should start the Belloc Society, because you'd be a good guy to run the Belloc Society. These were two great friends who were both giant literary figures and just giant intellects. And the fact that they, were given to us at the same time and were comrades is really really amazing. But people tend to equate the two, and you can't equate the two. They're very different, and I think that's part of the charm, is that they are so different. Chesterton once said that Belloc and I are completely different. It's just that we happen to agree on religion and politics. And it's because they agreed on religion and politics that everyone grouped them together all the time. They always defended each other in print. But one of the main differences, Belloc was a cradle Catholic, and he was, in a group of really great literary figures who really was the only one who was Catholic going into it. Many of the others converted, among them, of course, Chesterton. But Belloc always brought a different perspective as someone who was fighting for the faith from the beginning, and really took on the English establishment and what's called the Whig version of history in a way that nobody could comprehend that there was this Catholic explanation that the Catholic faith had been stolen from the English people by some really horrible events under Henry VIII.
Did they play bad cop, good cop?
Well, I think you see a little bit of that with certain figures, like with H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells, who knew them both, H.G. Wells could not stand Belloc, but he loved Chesterton. If H.G. Wells said, if I get into heaven, it's going to be because I knew G.K. Chesterton. But Belloc was a little more merciless than his friend Chesterton, and didn't have quite the same soft edges. But he absolutely went for the truth like a hound dog, and when he got his jaws on it, wouldn't let go.
What do you think Chesterton would say to the phenomenon of this independent Christianity that's running rampant in our country today, that really wasn't existent during his lifetime as much? Usually during his lifetime, if a Methodist was born a Methodist, they would stay a Methodist till they died. Lutheran, Presbyterian, all that. Well, since then, now, not only has it gone to where Methodist will easily bounce to a Presbyterian, is we have this exponential growth of these totally independent churches that have no real connection with historic Christianity.
Right. The big churches that used to be called Baptist, they take the word Baptist off there because they want to be the universal church. So they take off that denominational name because they think they will appeal to everyone if they remove that denomination. And I think Chesterton did have a sort of insight when he said that America is this kind of boiling pot of all these different sects, and it creates new sects all the time. And it's something kind of unique to our history because of the religious freedom motif. People felt free to start their own denominations as well, and that's why you have the whole variety of the really strange little cults that have gotten big in some cases. And the others that they have no authority that they're appealing to other than themselves and their own interpretation of the sacred scriptures, and that's they have a way of breeding and splitting and continuing to spread out that way. But I think the great weakness is that they don't have one authority they can go to, unless it's this one cult figure within it. And of course, when he's gone, someone else will rise up, and replace him.
It would seem to me that in the life of Chesterton, if a person broke away and started his own church, a part of his argument would be why he did that. Today, there's no even explanation. You just do it.
Yeah.
You start your own church on a Tuesday, and there you are. No apologies. You don't have to feel a need to defend why you're starting your own church. It's become so rampant and easy.
Yeah, it is interesting to see how he portrays some of these characters. It's mostly in his fiction, and because Father Brown visits America in a few of the Father Brown stories, and he'll talk about some cult. He usually has a very long Old Testament name.
Something else that strikes me is every Mass in the confession, when we confess, we say, I have greatly sinned in my thoughts, in my words, what I have done, what I have failed to do. And we kind of take that for granted in Catholic. We say that. But it's because we live in a culture that says at the core of our culture, nobody has a right to tell me the way I'm going to think, what I'm going to say, what I'm going to do, what I'm going to not to do. Did Chesterton anticipate that our culture would become so relativistic?
Well, he makes a good point, and it's a point that I enlarge on in my new book, Marcus.
Which we'll talk about after the break.
Right. But the atheist basically is more anxious to deny sin than he is to deny God. Because when you start talking about the reality of sin, then you have to bring up God. And so our culture does not want to talk about sin, because if you talk about sin, that's going to lead to theology.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. All right. Well, we'll mention your book when we get back, and I think we've got a few emails that we'll grab when we get after the break. All right. Our guest tonight is Dale Ahlquist. What a great pleasure. See you in a bit. Welcome back to the Journey Home. I'm your host, Marcus Grodi, and our guest is Dale Ahlquist. It's great to have Dale here. And I want to mention your book in a little bit, a new book coming out. But I wanted to ask a question during the break. That's what I got distracted on. Was, here we are, Americans, emphasizing these two Brits, making a big deal out of Chesterton and Belloc. But it is kind of a struggle because during that whole period of the late 19th century, early 20th century, we had kind of a dearth of American Catholic writers.
Yeah, it's really true. I think there's probably two reasons for that. One is that Americans don't speak English as well as the Brits do. I mean, Chesterton and Belloc, they're so eloquent, they're so articulate, and they can't even be approached because they're so good. But they were really popular in the United States too. Chesterton especially during his lifetime. He did two speaking tours in the United States. It was front page news wherever he went. I guess it's because we had Chesterton, we had him on both sides of the Atlantic in a way. But America wasn't producing any great Catholic writers during that exact same period. They came right before that, like with Orestes Brownson, and right after that, Fulton Sheen starts writing right after that, and you get these other ones that are coming. But it's during that period from about 1900 to 1930. It was those British Catholic writers, most of whom were converts, that really kind of filled the literary scene.
Yeah. And one book I know it's not your book, so I guess you may not want me to mention it, but I'll mention it anyway. Joseph Pierce's wonderful book on literary converts, I still think is a wonderful read.
Oh yeah, that's a great book, yeah.
And it was really in that book, again, that helped me appreciate who Belloc and Chesterton were. Helped me see that. And he talks about the dearth of Americans during that period. I think we've come back, and in the last 50, 60, 70 years, we've got some great Catholic American writers.
Yeah.
But including yourself.
And you.
But you do have a new book out called All Roads, Catholic Apology. How did this book come about, and especially out of your own journey?
Yes, I do tell my conversion story in there, and but it's called Roman Catholic Apologetics, ROAMIN apostrophe. The idea is that every conversation we get into is an opportunity to evangelize. Every subject you talk about somehow will lead to a discussion of the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church will have something to say about it, and something true to say. And so, in that sense, all roads do lead to Rome, because we have all kinds of opportunities to evangelize during the day. And the objections come up. Sometimes they come up suddenly. There's a throwaway comment. There's a good opportunity to defend the position of the Catholic faith. Obviously, with big issues like the life issues and the big morality issues, yes, but also in little things too. And so it's just a sequence of essays that are all kind of naturally arranged about defending the faith.
With all those roads leaning to Rome, what would you say from your experience is got the biggest road bump in it that stands the biggest barrier? Even though all conversations can be a road to Rome.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the general answer to that is what Chesterton says in his book on St. Francis: people will not broaden their minds enough to believe. People have such a narrow view of the Catholic Church, and they don't realize that it's their own view that's narrow, and that the Catholic Church has not only anticipated their objection, but is much, much bigger than they can even imagine it is. And so that's the general mentality. But then so whatever they focus on, they think, well, that's all the Catholic Church cares about, whether it's contraception or abortion or Mary or whatever issue they see. That's their little thing, and it just makes them look at the church as a very narrow thing.
I was thinking it's like our Bible-believing Christian brothers and sisters, Bible only. They love Scripture, as we did before.
Yes.
And we thought that Catholics don't read Scripture. Does the Catholic Church even follow Scripture? Totally ignorant of the fact the only reason they have Scripture is because of the Catholic Church.
In fact, Chesterton makes that exact same point in his Catholic Church in Conversion. He talks about the guy watching the Catholic procession going by. He sees the candles and the smells and the the crucifix and the priest with his robes and the guy holding up the scrolls. And he could understand someone looking at that and saying, it's all bosh. But what he can't understand is someone watching the same procession go by and saying, it's all bosh except for the scrolls. Because that's what they've done. They've just taken one thing out of the Catholic Church, and that's, every other Christian who's not a Catholic has somehow narrowed the faith and chosen the thing that they want and left out the rest to their own chagrin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, because with the Bible alone, then I can interpret the way I
Right.
want, or the way I believe it to be
Right.
true. We have an email, Eugene from Austin, Texas. What do you think Chesterton would say the Catholic Church has to offer modern society? So many people think Catholicism is archaic and outdated.
Okay, yeah. Chesterton would love a question like that, because we are obsessed with the new. Modern. He says the first time in human history people are proud of being modern. It wasn't even a term before, and this false notion of progress that somehow we've gotten past the past, and we can only embrace the new thing because new is better. Whereas Chester would show that not only is the church still true, all these ancient truths still true, but they're actually quite new. Every other new idea, well, what happens to it is it gets old right away. Just look at the series of fads and fashions and how quickly they change. The church has not. The church has stayed the same, proclaiming the same message with the same sacraments. Nothing has changed. On the contrary, it keeps developing and getting richer. And you hold those two things side by side, and it's the new things that fade, the old thing that is continually new.
Isaiah makes a comment that there'll come a time when good is called evil and evil is called good.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about the word sophisticated. Originally was a totally negative thing. To call someone sophisticated, now that's what people want to be.
Yeah, they want to be that, even though they don't even realize what the word means. It means wise, which means you have some grasp of the past. Because that's what you need to be wise, is to understand the past, yeah.
All right, Heather from Boise writes, when Dale was beginning to consider the Catholic faith, was there a particular doctrinal struggle he went through on account of his upbringing as a Baptist?
Oh, that's a good one. As so many evangelicals, I certainly had the problems with the understanding of Mary, especially the most recent dogmas, which would be the Assumption and the Immaculate Conception. So it took some real time to come to the fullness of understanding about those things, so that I was really at peace about them and could explain them to others. Because you're not really at peace with a doctrine until you can explain it believably to someone else, and that's what those were probably the last two hurdles for me.
A question, again, a Chesterton question. It seems to me that the church's openness to ecumenism, especially after Pius XII and then John the 23rd, and a recognizing of the work of God's love and mercy outside the structure of the church, in many ways came from the experiences of World War II, when Catholics and non-Catholic Christians and Jews were standing side by side and recognized the fruits of God's love. Chesterton died before all that. He died before World War II. He only saw the Great War, and during that time. Where was Chesterton in ecumenism?
Well, the great irony is that he is such an ecumenical writer. I mean, he's well loved by Catholics and non-Catholics. I was a non-Catholic when I fell in love with Chesterton, and he has this broad appeal, and so in some ways he anticipates the ecumenical movement. He also anticipates Vatican II and the lay spirituality. He absolutely personifies what Vatican II is talking about with lay people evangelizing, and but he says, the way to embrace someone who believes differently is not to say, come into my arms and let's forget our differences. He says, because you may encounter someone who says, well, I advise you to mind your eye, because we do have differences. And he says, he says it's actually better to find out what another person believes, and then you can discuss the differences. But to actually let another person explain what their belief is, and then you can have actual dialogue. But it doesn't begin until both sides make their case. And Chesterton was such a masterful debater that he he truly listened to what his opponent had to say. And that's our main problem, is that we don't. We don't listen to our opponents.
Which was why he would, a man like H.G. Wells, would consider him a friend,
Yeah.
even though they were at opposite ends of many, many issues.
Yeah, probably every issue. They didn't agree on much, but yet their friendship was the supreme thing, and that's why they could talk to each other.
Yeah, well, it does confirm why key evangelization is relational with your friends. I mean, that's what justifies the clarity of what you believe. It can be seen in your friendship. If it can't, then it's
speaking the truth in love, so that you're not afraid to say the truth, but because you're loving the person, that's the thing they see as the love.
All right. Clint from Oregon writes, in Mr. Ahlquist's opinion, what are some unique strengths and insights that Catholic authors give to their work as opposed to simply someone who writes from a secular perspective?
Well, I mean, Chesterton would argue that we do have the truth on our side, and it's a full truth. So we can really see both sides of a question, and it goes back to an Aristotelian and Thomas Aquinas Thomistic way of arguing and of approaching the world, is that you have to understand your opponent's argument as well as he does, or even better than he does. Mm-hmm. And the Catholic writer can really present both sides of an issue. And the non-Catholic writer really never has the insight into the truth that the Catholic writer is going to have. They will bring out truths, they will bring out certain truths, but not the fullness of truth that the Church offers. And I think that's the great shift right there. We don't have to be afraid of knowing the truth and proclaiming it. And I think sometimes we are.
That question gets me into, we haven't talked much about distributism yet, and our audience may not be familiar with the term, but I'm wondering if it was because of both Chesterton's and Belloc's Catholic understanding of the world, of humanity, of creation and God, that led them in the distributist perspective as opposed to capitalism and socialism.
Well, absolutely. It's the demand for justice, and justice is one of the great virtues. We often forget that, and it came out of Catholic teaching. It came out of Pope Leo XIII, and they really, they wanted to see the world a better place. They wanted to see the poor man taken care of, but not just a handout. They wanted to see everyone have the independence and dignity of building something for themselves and working for themselves and taking care of their family without being a wage slave or without being just a peon of the government or something. And so I absolutely believe that all their ideas on distributive justice are Catholic based and Catholic inspired, and it has to do with the fullness of the faith. That's what it's about.
Yep. All right. Dominic from Washington, D.C. writes, I realize Chesterton wrote on a wide variety of topics and had a great depth. What are some of his more Catholic works? And does Dale have a particular favorite of these?
Yes, I hope he doesn't want to ask me which of my children is my favorite either. Yeah, so I'll tell you, obviously, it's interesting. The Father Brown stories, there's 50-some Father Brown stories, I think 52. Some of them are more Catholic than others. That's what's really interesting. And yet he wrote half of them before his own conversion. So half the Father Brown stories were written by a non-Catholic. And yet it shows great insight into the sacraments, into confession, into Catholic mentality. There's a great ecumenical line in one of the stories where Father Brown is talking to this Protestant because he's trying to find out what happened in this murder, and the process. I'll have you know, Father Brown, I'm a very strong Protestant. And Father Brown says, well, that's good. I like strong Protestants because I know they'll tell the truth. And it's a great line. But there's, I think, one of the best and most Catholic Father Brown stories was one called The Chief Mourner of Marne. The Chief Mourner of Marne. And it's a great insight into confession. I really point that one out. Obviously, his book, The Catholic Church and Conversion, that we've talked about in this program, is a very Catholic book. And the other two that really come to mind are The Thing. The subtitle is Why I Am a Catholic, and the other one is The Well and the Shallows, which is one of his last books. And It's a series of essays that are really quite distinctively Catholic.
Would Chesterton or Belloc have anticipated or been surprised by the rise of radical Islam that's impending and really threatening the world around?
No, they wouldn't have been surprised. They actually predicted that exactly, both of them. I could talk a little bit more about what Chesterton said about Islam than what Belloc said, but Belloc talks about it in his book, The Great Heresies.
Yeah.
And they both talk about Islam being a heresy. It's something that actually came out of Christianity. It was a Christian world that Muhammad lived in, and he was reacting to the Christian doctrines that he heard, and he basically chose the ones he liked. And that's what a heresy is. It's choosing truths, but leaving out other truths. And just the whole concept of God within Islam is a heresy of the Trinity. It's taking just part of the Trinity, the most mysterious part, God the Father, the one who is feared, leaving out God the Spirit, who is love, and God the Incarnation, the Son of God. And with just that focus on that one part of the Trinity, God becomes very fearful and mysterious. And Chesterton says, it is the lonely God of the desert who has created the cruel children of the desert. And by the same token, he also says, Muhammad being a warlord, Islam's going to create more warlords. It's going to, because there is only one Muhammad. He says there's actually going to be thousands of Muhammads. And then the other thing is they both agree that Islam's going to be a permanent menace to Christendom, a permanent menace. They use that term. But Chesterton says our chief peril is not attack, it is decay. Really good insight.
Does Chesterton deal with the trajectory of private interpretation? You see it around the world. You go to countries like, or cities like Amsterdam, or places where, they were one time Catholic, they broke away with the ideal of Scripture alone. It's going to be the Spirit. We love Jesus Christ, we'll follow it. But the trajectory has always been towards relativism.
Right.
And we see it in our country in spades. Did they anticipate that?
Well, I think, when Chesterton says, that the tragedy of the Protestant Reformation and the splitting apart of Western society that came from that moment, it wasn't just Protestant versus Catholic anymore. It was Protestant versus Protestant, and then eventually the protestation came to the point that you have non-Christians who are still protesting, not only against Protestants but against each other. It's just a constant fragmentation that came from that moment when there was the split in the church. And what he really points out is how Calvinism led to all of the bad modern philosophies that all are attack on free will, so that people now blame their behavior on something else, and they do not take responsibility for their behavior. So obviously you saw that in Calvinism and the predestination, but then you see it in biology, you see it in psychology, you see it in economics. All these fatalistic, predeterministic, that here's this scientific explanation of everything, and your will doesn't play a role in it at all.
Yeah, and he was contemporary with Huxley. Right, and
yes.
That whole movement, the Darwin, the trajectory of that Darwinian that was affecting the culture at the time. Of Chesterton.
Obviously he was friends with Aldous Huxley, who is the son and grandson of T.H. Huxley, who was the great apologist for Darwin. But Aldous Huxley and them were very good friends. Aldous Huxley actually attended Chesterton's funeral.
Another question. A wonderful book that's come out in the last 10 years or so is The Stripping of the Altars. And it's a book that kind of opens the door to challenge the idea that had always been kind of the common view of Anglicanism, that the church was in horrible shape, and Henry VIII and all of his reformers brought back life to the church, when in fact the book says it's nothing but the truth. Had Chesterton and Belloc recognized the same thing?
Well, I think one of the earliest reviews of The Stripping of the Altars nailed it when they said, "What do you know? Belloc was right." Because Belloc had argued the same thing, and so had Chesterton, that the destruction of the monasteries was the people having their Catholic faith stolen from them. It was the monasteries that built Europe, built England, and that's what carried Christian culture forward, and they were just willfully destroyed by people who wanted the power and wanted the money and the prestige that was created by a monastic culture that brought culture along. And in one of the Father Brown stories, there's a case where someone is living in something called an abbey, and there's the famous show Downton Abbey. That was a Catholic monastery at one point. That's the whole point. And this was truly stolen from the Catholic Church.
It seems that one of the areas of culture that the devil has particularly attacked in the modern world is friendship.
Yeah.
Male friendship. There was a time when men would be comfortable doing all kinds of things, where today it's all suspect, and the devil laughs. Chesterton and Belloc, in that word, did they talk about the value of friendship?
Yeah, they talk about the value of friendship, and also it harkens back to St. Francis, his book on St. Francis, where he says, it's through our friends that we really experience God's love. And Francis brought a group of men together, and there was nothing suspect about what they did, but they were a community of brothers and believers, that what the friars were. And in the secular realm, Christian brothers, had that same bond that is different from the relationship they had with everyone else. And Chesterton says there are certain manly activities that men should enjoy together, and that's the beauty of the difference of the sexes. And he saw that the destruction of feminism was that they were trying to really break apart the male world that had that camaraderie that was needed for their own sanity, really. This one woman said, why can't you treat me like one of your comrades? And he said to her, well, madam, if I treated you like a comrade, you'd throw me out of the house. And I think they knew about the decadent underpinnings that were coming out of the 1890s and Oscar Wilde and all that. And it was something that no one openly talked about because it was so distasteful. It was just something nobody talked about. But Chester has just a few subtle hints of what the what's wrong with that rise of same-sex attractions and just living out those things. Chesterton said, the moment that sex ceases to be a servant, it becomes a tyrant. And the men who would enjoy each other's company, they did it in a completely non-sexual way, and that's why it was so wholesome.
Yeah.
That's why it was so wholesome.
Yeah, you look at Belloc's book, The Four Men.
Yeah.
And just imagine that being interpreted today. It just totally miss and read back into completely a mess. Minute or so to go. Let's say there's a Baptist watching. You're talking to them. Why should they consider the fullness of the church?
Well, the key verse that I think was just overlooked in my whole Baptist experience is, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. I don't think there's too many ways to get around a Eucharistic understanding of what communion is. And as Baptists, I think we avoided it. The other one that, of course, we avoided so much was when Jesus gives that authority to Peter. He says, I'm going to build my church on you, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. I'm going to give you the keys of the kingdom, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. There is the authority given to the first pope, and I think it was the great poet Hopkins, Gerard Manley Hopkins. It says the way the Protestants try to get around the interpretation of that verse is enough to make one Catholic.
Yeah, and partially because as an evangelical, I took the Bible infallibly, inspired. I took it all except a few verses I'm uncomfortable with, and so I put a spin on them to avoid the clear implication of what they say.
Just take those verses for what they say, and you'll be home in Rome very shortly.
All right, my friend. Thank you.
God bless you, Marcus.
Thank you, Dale, for joining us on the journey home. Look forward to another one of your programs on EWTN.
Great.
And your new book, All Roads. We look forward to that. Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. First of all, I hope that you've enjoyed Dale's presentation on the journey home, but I also hope that you look for other times that he's on EWTN helping us appreciate not only what he's come to discover in Jesus Christ and his church, but helping us discover the beauty of Chesterton and how he can help us grow deeper in our faith. God bless you. See you again next week.